There's a pattern in history that hides in plain sight. In 1870, Britain controlled nearly 25% of global trade. Its GDP still rising, even as its factories emptied and its industrial edge quietly vanished. By 1931, the pound collapsed and the empire never recovered. In 1989, Japan was the richest society on earth, its GDP soaring, its stock market worth more than the rest of the world combined. 15 years later, wages were frozen, growth was an illusion, and an entire generation was lost. In 1988, the Soviet Union reported economic expansion, full employment, and stability. 3 years later, it no longer existed. Different centuries, different systems, same outcome. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following the exact same pattern. And here's what should terrify you. The numbers say everything is fine, but history says collapse always begins this way. Before we go through this pattern, you need to understand what a silent depression actually means. Not in theory, in practice. It isn't a sudden crash. It isn't breadlines appearing overnight or markets collapsing in a single afternoon. It's far more dangerous than that. A silent depression is when the economy appears healthy on paper while the foundations beneath it are eroding in real time. GDP rises, stock markets climb. Headlines talk about resilience and recovery, but underneath, wages stop growing, productivity stalls, and debt replaces real income as the engine of demand. At first, almost no one notices. Living standards don't collapse immediately. They slowly flatten, then they begin to slip. People work more hours to maintain the same life. Governments borrow to preserve the illusion of stability. Central banks intervene to smooth over every shock. But here's the critical detail. When growth is driven by leverage instead of production, it cannot compound. It only accumulates risk. That's not theoretical. That's documented history. Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union all showed rising output while their core systems were failing. By the time the truth became visible, the adjustment was no longer optional. Let me show you how this pattern unfolded 3 times before and why it's happening again. Let's start with Britain. By 1870, Britain stood at the peak of global power. It produced roughly 32% of the world's manufactured goods, controlled the world's dominant currency, and governed an empire covering nearly a quarter of the planet's land and population. London was the financial center of the world. The pound sterling was global money. On paper, Britain's economy was still expanding. GDP continued to rise. Trade volumes looked strong, but this is where the pattern begins. By the late 1870s, something fundamental had changed. Britain's industrial advantage was slipping. Germany and the United States began producing steel more efficiently. In 1870, Britain produced about 6 million tons of steel. By 1890, the United States was producing more, and Germany was rapidly closing the gap. British factories were older, less mechanized, and slower to adapt. Instead of reinvesting heavily in domestic industry, British capital flowed outward, into railways in Argentina, into mines in South Africa, into government bonds across the empire. Finance replaced production. At first, this looked like success. Foreign investments generated steady returns. London banks expanded. By 1900, Britain owned roughly 45% of all overseas investments worldwide. GDP kept growing. The numbers looked reassuring. But here's the critical detail. Domestic productivity growth slowed dramatically. Real wages for British industrial workers stagnated between 1875 and 1900. Output rose, but it was increasingly disconnected from the lives of ordinary people. By 1913, the pattern was entrenched. Britain still ran a vast empire, but it imported more manufactured goods than it exported. Its trade surplus depended on financial services and investment income, not factories. When World War I began in 1914, the system cracked. Britain borrowed heavily to fund the war, suspending the gold standard in 1914 and emerging in 1918 with debts exceeding 130% of GDP. The empire survived, but the economic core was weakened. The real damage came after. In 1925, under Chancellor Winston Churchill, Britain made a fatal decision. It returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value of $4.86. This overvalued the currency by an estimated 10%. British exports became uncompetitive overnight. Coal production fell from 287 million tons in 1913 to 233 million by 1926. Unemployment hovered above 10% for most of the decade. GDP still grew modestly. The illusion held, but industry was dying. By 1931, the debt-fueled financial system could no longer support the strain. Gold reserves drained. Investors lost confidence. In September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard again. The pound fell by nearly 30%. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the endpoint of a 60-year silent depression. Britain didn't disappear, but it never regained industrial dominance. That's what the pattern looks like. Let's jump forward nearly a century. Japan. In 1985, Japan appeared unstoppable. It had risen from post-war ruin to become the second largest economy on Earth. Japanese firms dominated automobiles, electronics, shipbuilding, and semiconductors. By 1987, Japan's GDP was growing at over 4% annually. Unemployment sat below 3%. The numbers looked flawless. But just like Britain, the foundation was already shifting. The turning point came with the Plaza Accord in September 1985. Under pressure from the United States, Japan agreed to allow the yen to appreciate. In just 2 years, the yen rose from 240 per dollar to nearly 120. Exports became less competitive overnight. Instead of allowing a slowdown, Japanese policymakers responded with aggressive monetary easing. Interest rates were cut 5 times between 1986 and 1987. Credit flooded the system. The result was not productive investment, it was speculation. By 1989, land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was valued higher than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index surged to nearly 39,000 points. Corporate profits looked strong. GDP growth continued. Just like Britain, finance replaced production. Sound familiar? But here's where it gets worse. When the Bank of Japan finally raised rates in 1989, the bubble burst. By 1992, the Nikkei had lost over 60% of its value. Asset prices collapsed, but GDP didn't crash. It flattened. From 1992 to 2002, Japan's economy grew at an average of just 1% per year. Officially, there was no depression. In reality, wages stagnated, lifetime employment eroded, household consumption stalled. Just like Britain, policymakers doubled down on illusion. Government debt exploded from 68% of GDP in 1991 to over 150% by 2000. Infrastructure projects replaced organic growth, bridges to nowhere, roads without traffic. GDP stayed positive. Living standards did not improve. The same mistake that destroyed Britain was closing in. Capital was preserving appearances instead of productivity. By 2005, Japan had endured 15 years of stagnation without a formal collapse. An entire generation entered the workforce without rising wages or expectations. Different century, different continent, identical collapse of dynamism. The pattern played out again. Now, let's look at the most recent example. The Soviet Union. You probably remember this one. Or at least, you remember how it ended. What most people forget is how long the illusion lasted before the collapse. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union was still considered a superpower. It controlled Eastern Europe, rivaled the United States militarily, and commanded enormous natural resources. Official statistics reported steady growth. In 1970, Soviet GDP was estimated at roughly 60% of the US level. By 1980, it was still rising. On paper, the system looked stable. But here's what people didn't understand. Soviet growth had become almost entirely extensive, not productive. More labor, more raw materials, more inputs, but almost no efficiency gains. By 1975, total factor productivity had turned negative. Factories met quotas by producing unusable goods. Steel output rose, but machinery quality collapsed. Grain harvests increased in tonnage, yet food shortages worsened. The numbers said progress. Reality said decay. By the early 1980s, the pattern was accelerating. Oil exports masked the damage. In 1981, energy accounted for over 50% of Soviet hard currency earnings. That revenue paid for grain imports, consumer goods, and political stability. GDP kept growing, but the system had become fragile. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, falling by nearly 60% in a single year, the illusion shattered. Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985 and tried to reform a system that no longer functioned. Perestroika loosened controls. Glasnost exposed corruption. Output fell instead of rising. By 1989, shortages were visible in major cities. In 1990, GDP contracted by roughly 4%. In 1991, it fell by more than 15%. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. Britain took decades. Japan took 15 years. The Soviet Union took 5. In December 1991, the flag came down 3 times. 3 systems, 3 collapses, all following the exact same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United States is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage. At first glance, everything looks strong. In 2024, U.S. GDP surpassed $28 trillion. Unemployment hovered near 4%. Stock markets reached record highs. Officials pointed to growth, resilience, and recovery. But you already know how this story works. The numbers look fine right up until they don't. Stage 1 is productivity decoupling. Real economic strength comes from producing more value per worker. That's the engine. In the United States, that engine began sputtering years ago. From 1948 to 1973, productivity grew at about 2.8% annually. From 2005 to 2023, it averaged barely 1.2%. Since 2019, it has been even weaker. GDP still rises, but it's no longer coming from efficiency. Check. Stage 2 is wage stagnation. When productivity slows, wages follow. Adjusted for inflation, median U.S. wages barely moved between 2019 and 2024. In real terms, many households lost purchasing power after the inflation surge of 2021 and 2022, when consumer prices rose over 15% in just 2 years. GDP recovered faster than incomes, just like Japan, just like Britain. Check. Stage 3 is financialization. When production weakens, finance fills the gap. By 2024, the financial sector accounted for roughly 8% of U.S. GDP, but captured over 25% of corporate profits. Stock buybacks exceeded $800 billion in 2023 alone. That's not investment in factories or skills. That's capital recycling. Asset prices rise. Output does not. Check. Stage 4 is debt replacing income. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. In 1980, total U.S. debt stood at about 160% of GDP. By 2007, it was 350%. By 2024, it exceeded 420%. Federal debt alone crossed $34 trillion in late 2024, more than 120% of GDP. Households, corporations, and governments all depend on borrowing to sustain consumption. GDP grows because spending grows. Spending grows because debt grows. Check. Stage 5 is policy intervention becoming permanent. Temporary measures turn structural. After 2008, near zero interest rates lasted 7 years. After 2020, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion in less than 2 years. Even after rate hikes in 2022 and 2023, markets remain dependent on central bank credibility. Every slowdown triggers expectations of rescue. This is not a market, it's life support. Check. Stage 6 is inequality masking fragility. GDP is an average. It doesn't tell you who benefits. From 2020 to 2024, the top 10% of households owned over 90% of U.S. stock market gains. The bottom half held almost no financial assets. Asset inflation boosted GDP. Living standards for most people did not rise with it. That divergence is always present before a silent depression becomes visible. Check. Stage 7 is external confidence erosion. This is subtle at first. The dollar remains dominant, but cracks appear. In 2015, the dollar made up about 66% of global reserves. By 2024, that figure had fallen closer to 58%. Countries increased gold purchases to record levels in 2022 and 2023, led by China and Russia. BRICS nations discuss settlement systems outside the dollar. None of this causes collapse on its own, but Britain saw it. The Soviet Union felt it. Confidence doesn't vanish overnight. It thins. Check. Here's the critical point. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. Just like Britain, the United States shifted from production to finance. Just like Japan, it used debt and asset inflation to avoid adjustment. Just like the Soviet Union, it relies on headline numbers that hide structural weakness. Different system, same mechanics. So where are we in the sequence? Based on history, the United States is late-stage silent depression. The next stage is forced adjustment that can take many forms. Higher inflation that erodes debt, currency depreciation that reduces purchasing power, fiscal crisis that forces spending cuts, or a combination of all three. Stage 8 is political strain. You're already seeing it. Polarization isn't cultural, it's economic. When growth no longer improves lives, trust collapses. Institutions lose legitimacy. Every historical case shows this phase. Britain in the 1920s, Japan in the 1990s, the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Stage 9 is the reckoning. This is where the illusion breaks. Not necessarily in markets first, often in budgets, currencies, or geopolitics. Maybe it takes 5 years, maybe 10, maybe less. The pattern doesn't give exact dates, it gives sequences, and this is where it becomes personal. Your savings are priced in dollars. Your job depends on consumption. Your retirement is tied to asset values. When growth is real, those systems compound. When growth is artificial, they're fragile. Silent depressions don't feel like disasters at first. They feel like confusion, then disappointment, then shock. 3 times before, societies believed they had found a way around the math. They hadn't. The pattern says adjustment always comes.